Welcome to The Debate. Imagine showing up to vote, holding the exact same ID card you've used for decades.
Right? Just expecting a totally normal election day.
Exactly. You wait in line, you walk up to the official, and they type your name into a system. But then, they look up at you and tell you that, legally speaking, you no longer exist.
Oh, wow.
You have no vote. You basically have no voice.
And, in 2026, that wasn't just some hypothetical thought experiment for one or two unlucky people. That was the sudden, shocking reality for nearly 10 million Indian citizens.
Yeah, it really was. Today, we are unpacking the unprecedented 2026 electoral crisis in India. We're looking specifically at the Election Commission of India's Special Intensive Revision.
Often referred to as the SIR, right?
Right, the SIR. This was a massive, systematic overhaul of the voter rolls, primarily concentrated in West Bengal and Odisha.
Have to answer today is this. Is the Election Commission's Special Intensive Revision a necessary administrative purification to secure electoral integrity and national security? Or is it an unconstitutional, targeted mass disenfranchisement that signals institutional capture?
Exactly. And just to be clear on where we both stand, I will be arguing that the revision, despite the immense administrative friction it obviously caused, was a legitimate and long overdue purification of the voter database. It's a process justified by the doctrine of electoral finality and, quite frankly, national security.
And my position is that when you look at the highly skewed demographic data of who was actually deleted, combined with the extreme hostility of the Election Commission and the tragic deaths of ground-level officers, it proves this was a calculated democratic robbery, not a routine audit.
Let's start by establishing the sheer scale of what happened here, because the context of this special intensive revision is vital to understanding why the Election Commission acted the way it did. We're talking about the removal of approximately 91 lakh, that's 9.1 million names from the electoral rolls in West Bengal alone.
Yeah, an astronomical number.
And another 9.8 lakh were deleted in Odisha. Alongside this, the ECI mandated the abolition of traditional physical voter IDs,
which effectively stripped millions of people of their only tangible proof of enfranchisement. I mean, they had nothing to hold in their hands anymore.
Sure, but let's look at why that had to happen. When you have a system that has been plagued by allegations of fake entries, duplicate voters, and illegal infiltrators for literally decades, a systemic audit isn't a luxury. It's a necessity.
But at what cost to the legitimate voter?
Well, think of the Indian voter roll as this unimaginably massive, highly corrupted digital database. If a database has been neglected or politically manipulated for years, it fills up with garbage data.
I hear that, but we aren't talking about spreadsheets here. We are talking about actual citizens.
We are talking about the administrative mechanism that verifies those citizens. I mean, how do you clean a database of nearly 1 billion people? You don't do it by hand.
Right, you use automation.
Exactly. You run an algorithmic deduplication audit. You cross-reference census data, you look for biometric mismatches, you scan for identical names appearing in multiple constituencies. When the Election Commission finally applied strict verification parameters to this database, millions of anomalies were naturally flagged.
A painful friction, essentially.
Yeah, what we call in tech data scrubbing. You cannot have a sovereign, democratic process if the database dictating that process is heavily populated by phantom entries and illegal entrants. It is fundamentally a matter of territorial integrity.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. I understand the theory of data scrubbing, but I want to look at the actual output of this algorithm because it completely shatters the illusion of an objective administrative audit.
How so?
Well, the ruling party claimed they were just removing illegal immigrants, what they termed the Ghuspetia, but opposition leaders rightfully identified this as the Ghuspetia hoax. Let's look at Nandagram, for example.
I mean, Nandagram is a uniquely complex constituency, though.
It is. A fiercely contested, border-proximate constituency in West Bengal, yes. But explain this. A staggering 95.5% of the voters removed from the rolls in Nandagram were Muslims.
Okay, but...
And furthermore, if you look at the wider statewide data, over 53% of the deleted voters overall were women. Now, how does a blind deduplication algorithm accidentally result in 95.5% of its false positives in a key battleground district coming from a single minority community? That is a statistical impossibility.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. I actually disagree that it's a statistical impossibility, especially when you factor in geography. Demographic clustering is a very well-documented sociological phenomenon.
You mean people settling in specific community blocks?
Right. When you have high levels of illegal infiltration across an international border, those individuals do not distribute themselves evenly across the state. They cluster in specific border-proximate areas like Nandigram, and they actively integrate into specific demographic communities to avoid detection.
So you're saying the algorithm was just following the geography?
Exactly. If the algorithm is hunting for undocumented border crossers, the resulting deletions are naturally going to reflect that clustering. It looks like a targeted demographic skew to a casual observer, but it's actually an accurate heat map of where the systemic vulnerabilities are concentrated.
Wait, but that assumes the algorithm was only processing objective inputs like census data. We have documented evidence that the inputs were highly partisan. The system was actively being gamed by human actors. Let's talk about Form 7.
Right, the standard election commission form used to object to a name on the voter roll or request a deletion.
Exactly. Any citizen can file a Form 7 if they believe someone on the roll doesn't belong there. But the Aam Aadmi Party, the AAP, submitted a 3,000-page dossier to the Election Commission proving that political workers were weaponizing these forms.
Ah, the bulk filing allegations.
Yes. Party cadres were bulk filing millions of Form 7 applications, specifically targeting the neighborhoods of their political opponents in areas like Shahadra, Janakpur, and Karaval Nagar. So your objective algorithm was simply rubber stamping a coordinated malicious flood of deletion requests submitted by political actors.
I wouldn't call it rubber stamping.
But that isn't a database cleaning itself. That is partisan weaponization.
Well, the sheer volume of those Form 7 applications, whether you believe they were maliciously filed or filed by concerned citizens acting as whistleblowers, is exactly what triggered the next phase of this crisis. The appellate system was entirely overwhelmed.
Completely broken under the weight of it, yeah.
When 9.1 million people are suddenly flagged for deletion, obviously millions of them are going to appeal to get their names back on the roll. And this is where we have to talk about how the justice system handled the fallout, because the Supreme Court's intervention is arguably the most critical piece of this entire puzzle.
And the Supreme Court was horrified by what they saw. They explicitly reprimanded the Election Commission for its administrative haste. Because of the millions of deletions, judicial officers at the local level were literally forced to clear over 1,000 appeal cases a day.
It was an incredibly accelerated timeline. There's no denying that.
Accelerated is an understatement. A judge clearing 1,000 cases in an 8-hour workday is spending roughly 28 seconds per case.
Right.
28 seconds to determine if a human being retains their constitutional right to exist in the democratic system. Justice Joy Mallya Bagchi made a profound observation during these hearings. He reminded the state that the right to vote for a person born in this country isn't just a bureaucratic technicality you can process in 28 seconds.
He called it sentimental, didn't he?
He did. He said it's sentimental. It is the core of their citizenship. And the Election Commission's process fundamentally trampled that sentimental right.
I concede the timeline was brutal and the human cost at the individual level was high. But we have to look at the Supreme Court's ultimate legal bottom line, not just their verbal reprimands during the hearings.
What do you mean?
Because when push came to shove, the Supreme Court refused to grant interim voting rights to those individuals who still had pending appeals.
Which effectively disenfranchised them for the entire 2026 cycle.
Yes, but for a constitutionally vital reason. Chief Justice Surya Kant stated unequivocally that allowing individuals to vote while their citizenship or residency status was still under pending appeal was entirely out of the question. We have to talk about the doctrine of electoral finality.
Go ahead and explain the doctrine, but I think its application here is deeply flawed.
Sure. For those unfamiliar, the doctrine of electoral finality is the legal principle that, at a certain point, the electoral roster must freeze. It's like locking the code base before launching a massive software update. You cannot hit pause on a national election of over 1 billion people while you wait for 1 million local appeals to slowly make their way through the courts.
But locking out legitimate voters.
If you allow potentially millions of unverified entries to vote just because they filed an appeal, you dilute and compromise the voting rights of every single legitimate citizen. The Supreme Court recognized that the roster had to lock. They had to prioritize the stability of the institution to prevent total electoral anarchy.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered how the Supreme Court had to stop it? They didn't just uphold the ECI's cutoff dates and walk away. The ECI's initial process was so fundamentally broken that the Supreme Court had to invoke Article 142 of the Constitution.
The Extraordinary Powers Clause.
Right. Article 142 is essentially the Supreme Court's constitutional nuclear option. It allows them to pass any order necessary to do complete justice when the standard laws or administrative processes fall short.
And they used it to create the supplementary rolls?
Exactly. The court used this power to legally mandate the Election Commission to create entirely new supplementary voter rolls specifically for appeals that were accepted by the cutoff dates of April 21 and April 27.
A massive logistical undertaking.
But if the ECI's database purification had been competent, if it was just a routine administrative exercise, the highest court in the land would not have had to rewrite the electoral roll at the 11th hour, using its extraordinary powers. The Supreme Court had to act as a failsafe because the Election Commission had gone rogue.
I really wouldn't call it going rogue. I would call it operating under siege. You are portraying the Election Commission as this monolithic oppressor hunting down voters. But we cannot divorce the ECI's rigid, almost militant strictness from the incredibly volatile, violent conditions they were operating under on the ground.
Are you referring to the state-level pushback?
I am referring to outright institutional hostility and violence. Look at the terrifying incident in Kaliachak, Malda. Malda is another border-proximate district, highly sensitive. During the revision process, local judicial officers, the very people tasked with managing these electoral rolls, were literally taken hostage by local actors.
It was a very dark moment, yes.
The Supreme Court itself referred to this hostage situation as a planned attempt by state-level political forces to derail the elections. When an election commission is trying to conduct a massive, sensitive audit in an environment where local authorities are inciting violence and officers are being held captive, they simply cannot afford to be flexible.
I see the strain there, but
Their rigid posture wasn't malice, It was a necessary armor to ensure the election happened at all.
I have to push back strongly on framing the Election Commission as the victim here. Yes, the Kaliachak incident was a severe breakdown of law and order, but it does not excuse the top-down hostility the ECI exhibited toward legitimate democratic stakeholders.
Hostility in what way?
Well, we have the widely reported incident on April 8, 2026. A delegation from the Trinamool Congress, the TMC, which is the ruling state party in West Bengal, went to meet with the chief election commissioner in New Delhi. They brought legitimate data about millions of deleted voters, and the delegates reported that the CEC told them to get lost.
Okay, but that was an alleged statement in a highly heated political meeting.
But it aligns perfectly with their technical behavior. Look at what happened with Modab Sheikh, a National Congress candidate. The Election Commission inexplicably deleted his name from the voter roll, a candidate running for office.
That was clearly a bureaucratic error.
But when the ECI was brought before the appellate tribunal, headed by Justice T.S. Sivanyanam, they couldn't even explain the technical mechanism of how or why he was deleted. They had to be formally reprimanded and forced to restore his name. But that is just bureaucratic incompetence. We need to talk about the human cost, because it goes far beyond deleted names. We have to talk about the BLOs.
The booth-level officers?
Yes. For our listeners who don't know, a booth-level officer isn't some high-ranking bureaucrat in New Delhi. These are local school teachers, municipal clerks, and public servants drafted into election duty.
Right, they do the heavily lifting on the ground.
They are the ones actually walking door to door, verifying addresses, and executing these deletions on the ground. During the second phase of this revision, AAP Member of Parliament Sanjay Singh issued a suspension of business notice in the Rajya Sabha, and it was regarding the mysterious deaths of booth-level officers across 12 different states and union territories.
It is a profound tragedy. Any loss of life in public service is terrible.
It is more than a tragedy, honestly. It is an indictment of the system. We are talking about unexplained deaths of ground-level officers in West Bengal, Odisha, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and beyond. MP Sanjay Singh explicitly tied these deaths to the immense, unconstitutional pressure exerted on these officers.
By the ECI?
Yes, they were being handed massive deletion quotas by the Central Election Commission, while simultaneously facing extreme resistance from their own local communities. This violates Article 21, the fundamental right to life.
But linking that directly to the commission is a huge claim.
When your administrative audit results in a nationwide pattern of dead field officers and a chief election commissioner telling opposition leaders to get lost, you cannot longer call it a database purification. It is institutional capture. It is an institution prioritizing demographic engineering over human life and democratic rights.
Look, I want to grapple directly with the tragedy of the BLOs because it is undeniably the darkest chapter of this entire crisis. But attributing those deaths to a coordinated, malicious conspiracy of institutional capture requires a massive leap of logic.
How is it a leap? The pressure came from the top.
You are assuming the Election Commission was operating with murderous intent, rather than viewing it as a massive, perhaps overly ambitious bureaucracy that structurally collapsed under the weight of an unprecedented logistical challenge. The BLOs were absolutely crushed between two opposing forces.
Right, the central mandate and the local pushback.
Exactly. A central mandate to clean up a heavily corrupted database and violent state-level resistance that wanted to protect those corrupted roles. The resulting tragedy is a failure of state capacity and security, not a calculated assassination plot by the Election Commission.
But you have to look at who benefits from that collapse of state capacity. When the Goose Battalion narrative is used to justify the deletion of millions of minorities in battleground districts, it's hard to ignore.
Again, the geography explains the demographics.
But when migrant workers in Odisha are wiped from the rolls simply because they traveled for labor and weren't home when the BLO knocked, when traditional voter IDs are abolished so people no longer have physical proof of their own enfranchisement, the pattern is undeniable. The strain only seemed to hurt one side of the political spectrum.
I think this is where we have to pull back and look at the macro picture of what a sovereign state requires to survive. To summarize my position today, the 2026 Special Intensive Revision was undoubtedly severe.
Very severe.
The timeline was brutal, the friction was immense, and the human cost placed on the appellate courts and the BLOs was incredibly high. However, a sovereign nation simply must secure its borders, and by extension, it must secure its voter rolls.
But surely not by stripping citizens of their rights.
You cannot defend democracy while simultaneously allowing your electoral database to be compromised by massive influxes of illegal infiltration and phantom entries. The Election Commission had a constitutional duty to scrub that data. And the Supreme Court, despite heavily criticizing the speed of the ECI, ultimately upheld the doctrine of electoral finality.
Because they had no other choice at that late stage.
They acknowledge that at the end of the day, the integrity and execution of the national election must supersede all else. You have to freeze the roster, or you simply don't have a country.
And to summarize my view, the integrity of a national election means absolutely nothing if millions of legitimate voters are locked out of the polling booth.
But we can't ignore the corrupted data.
The data points we've unpacked today, the targeted 95.5% Muslim deletions and nandogram, the weaponization of Form 7 applications through the 3,000-page AAP dossier, the outright opacity of the Election Commission failing to explain candidate deletions, and of course, the deeply troubling, unexplained deaths of booth-level officers across 12 states.
All of which were incredibly tragic, yes.
All of this points away from a simple administrative cleanup. It points unequivocally to an institutional capture that prioritized political convenience over the fundamental, sentimental, and constitutional right of the Indian citizen to cast a ballot.
Well, if there is one undeniable point of convergence we can share today, it is that the 2026 electoral process placed a historical, unprecedented strain on both the Indian judicial system and the individual voter.
Definitely.
The courts were forced to invent new fail-safes on the fly, and millions of citizens were forced to fight just to prove they existed.
Absolutely. The system was pushed past its breaking point, and the ordinary voter was the one crushed between the gears of these massive warring institutional powers.
Which is exactly why examining these events through multiple perspectives is so critical. There are no easy answers when a nation tries to balance the rigid security apparatus required to secure its borders with the fluid, deeply human democratic rights of the individuals living within them.
And honestly, there is far more to explore in the source material of the 2026 crisis, particularly regarding the long-term damage this event did to Indian federalism and the autonomy of state-level institutions.
Yeah, the ripples of this will be felt for decades.
Without a doubt.
Well, we will leave it to you, the listener, to form your own conclusion. But the next time you think about the mechanics of democracy, ask yourself this. When a government decides to aggressively scrub its database of 1 billion people, how do you ensure they aren't accidentally deleting the democracy itself?